So kind of wanted to make a video while it was daytime, but it kind of turned dark. I wanted to talk about accessory work in powerlifting, and just kind of some of the different types of it and like the reasons that you use it. Um, so accessory work, there are a few different types. I think the main ones that come to mind are accessory work to either build up like muscles, and to build up muscle mass and size, so through like accessory bodybuilding exercises, or you can have accessory movements that are variations of the big three lifts: the squat, the bench, the deadlift. And those variations, when you do accessories of those, it's to kind of mix up the stimulus that you get, versus if you were doing the main lift. And it's to kind of hit the main lift but like in a different way, and provide like a alternate stimulus that you get used to, so that you're strengthened again when you go and hit the main lift in its original form again. Often also when you do the accessory lift of that kind, so variation of a lift, you can work a part of the movement, so like a partial of the movement. You can work the upper half of the bench, the upper part of the bench, middle part of the bench, lower part of the bench, and you can do that with squat. You can do that with deadlift. So I can't go over like all of the different accessory movements, but I can just kind of go and list a few. I know, like, if you're doing variations of a lift, you have your conventional deadlift, you have sumo deadlift. You can also do stiff leg deadlift, you can do Romanian deadlift, you can do pause deadlift, you can do rack pulls, you can do block pulls, you can deadlift with chains. If you're doing squat, you can do pause squat, you can do like a 3-second pause squat, you can do a full ATG, ass to grass squat, you can front squat, you can low bar squat, you can high bar squat. Bench, there's bench press, there's slingshot bench, there's incline bench, there's 3-second pause bench, there's spoto press, there's close grip bench, and there's benching with chains. So like these that I all like listed, they're all variations of the lift. And if you kind of search each of them, you can kind of find where you might want to use them and what they kind of strengthen. In my opinion, you can use variations to kind of strengthen things in the off season, but like during the main, like when it's like in season and you're training for like your main powerlifting competition, I think it's kind of ideal to stick to the main lift and not the variation of it that much. You stick to like the main lift, and then maybe you do like kind of bodybuilding accessories at the end, but you do most of your work in the main lift when it's in season. And the reason for that is that when you're doing the main lift, you're training the bench and you train it for 10 to 12 weeks, and each week you increase weight a little bit, and you get stronger just a little bit. That's very specific, and you want to stay specific because that will translate directly to when you train in competition and you're hitting a one rep squat, a 1-rep bench, a 1-rep deadlift. So if you're a conventional deadlifter, in your competition prep, you kind of want to be training in conventional deadlift. You don't want to be training in sumo deadlift as primary and then switch to conventional for the competition, usually, because if you're training specific, then that translates to when you do competition day, that you've been training that lift for 10 weeks and your body's kind of used to doing it. It's familiar with it, and the form is very familiar, very comfortable, and you can kind of hit big weights with it. If you want to go for a heavy weight on competition day, you can. For this reason, with accessory lifts, like, you kind of tend to do bodybuilding accessory lifts when you're doing when you're training for in contest, like pre-contest competition, and you're in season, versus off season. You can kind of work the variations of the lift, and like build them up as much as you can, and maybe you're not doing your main versions of the lift. So if it's in season, you'd also do your accessory movements, the bodybuilding ones, because if you did those, then you kind of build up muscles, but then they're not taxing on your nervous system like the main lifts are, or like variations of the main lift are. So they're not compounds in that sense. They're not compound exercises in that sense. So a sample workout would be like, if you're in competition prep, it would be like you bench press, then after you do maybe some dumbbells, like dumbbell bench, you do some accessory exercises for chest and some accessory exercises for tricep, and that's it. And your main work will be 3 to 4 sets with however much percent, 60%, 70%, and a certain rep range of the main lift. It will be bench press, or it will be your competition squat, or it will be your competition deadlift. And then if it was off season, then it would be that would be in season, so that would be your main squat, your main bench, your main deadlift. And then if it was off season, it would be variations that you can kind of work. You wouldn't need to train like your main lift. The other reason that you would do the variations, of course, is that so that like you kind of don't train year round in just the competition style only, because what would happen then is that your body would kind of get used to it, and it would become too familiar, and it would if you did it past 12 weeks, past 16 weeks, and you're always only training the competition lift, then it would come at like some significant downsides, because then your body is too specific and it's not like kind of adapting anymore. Like, it needs a different stimulus to be able to adapt to, so that it can kind of rest from the old stimulus in that sense. So I'll talk a little more about accessory movements, bodybuilding accessory movements, and then I can like kind of wrap this video. So the bodybuilding accessory movements you kind of do when you're training for competition prep. So you do it with when you're training your main bench, main squat, main deadlift, like weeks in or months in leading into a competition prep. And the bodybuilding exercises, you'd be training your back, your chest, your arms, your legs, and maybe like shoulders a little bit too. And reasons for this are sometimes like when you do variations of a lift, like they help you to get a lift stronger. Sometimes you have a certain part of your lift, like the top of your bench or the bottom part of your deadlift, that kind of stick, and like that's like where you'll fail the lift, because that's kind of where you're weakest at it, and you can train that. But when you're training the accessory movements and you're building up the weak muscles, then you kind of you're doing it because sometimes you might have a weak muscle, and a lot of the time that might be what's holding you back at the lift. And it might not be that. Sometimes it is that like you're weakest at the bottom of your deadlift, but other times it is that maybe you have a weak back and you have to build up that back. So if you have a problem, typically you want to address the true root cause of the problem, and if that is a weaker muscle, then you want to be training those muscles. So it is important to kind of have that accessory work. I know a lot of powerlifters can be lazy about it, because after like 3, 4, or 5 sets of deadlifts or squats, you feel like you've done a lot of work and you are pretty taxed. But it's important to, even if it's light, even if it's semi-light, to still throw in the accessory movement for bodybuilding accessories. Some reasons why you want to have those bodybuilding accessory movements are that if you don't, then you kind of will be prone to injury more, because you're only doing bench, squat, deadlift, and you're not doing much else. You'll have muscular imbalances. You'll have kind of unilateral left-right imbalances, where since you're always only doing compound movements and you're not doing any isolation movements, maybe you're not building up those individual muscles, and maybe you're always pressing more with your right or pushing more with the right side of your squat or the right side of your deadlift, and you kind of develop uneven, and that can be a problem if it leads to injury when you're going for really heavy weights. So for that reason, and then for just kind of bringing up like your muscles, it doesn't have to be for a vain reason or for like bodybuilding or for looks necessarily. If you're a guy who's like, oh, I don't care about looks, it's still to your advantage to do the bodybuilding exercises, the bodybuilding accessory exercises, as secondary and tertiary movements to your main work, especially during competition prep, because they will kind of build up your muscles, and they'll make sure that you're like a chain and you don't have any weak link. All the individual muscles, the tiny muscles, are strong, and they can kind of hold their own. Even like powerlifters say that like, oh, there's no reason to train biceps, but I believe that that's actually really wrong, because if you train biceps, they'll help stabilize your bench. They'll help it so that you don't get like an injury during deadlift, and you don't tear a bicep during deadlift, and they'll help you kind of to hold up your squat and like to have strong forearms to like to assist with that. If you had weak biceps, that would kind of hold you back. so it's important to do those bodybuilding accessory exercises, and then the powerlifting variation accessory exercises. It's also important to do because like you kind of need it for your body to get that new stimulus and to train different parts, different variations of a movement. When you train different variations, it will kind of hit your muscles in a different way, and it will bring up like certain weak points that you might have had. Like if you had it'll bring up the weak points without you having to like put on more muscle or to strengthen a certain muscle with the bodybuilding exercises. So like let's say if you have like you're like they say if you're weak off the floor, sometimes you want to do deficit deadlifts where you're standing on plates and you do a deficit variation. Or if you're weak kind of in the middle, you can do a pause deadlift, and you pause, and then as you build that up over weeks, then suddenly you kind of strengthen that sticking point. So that's kind of it. I can't show all the exercises just on here, but like if you look up the different kinds of exercises that I talked about, you'll be able to find them all over like YouTube and stuff. And those are just kind of a large overview of like the two types of accessory movements, whether they be the bodybuilding type of accessory movement to bring up weak muscle groups, or they be the powerlifting type of accessory movement where you're kind of doing variations of the lift to bring up the lift itself, to bring up the main lift, and having kind of the carryover and the transfer from the variation lift to the main lift through just cycling on the variation lift for many weeks and a couple months. So those are just some thoughts on like the two types of accessory movements, and kind of let me know what you guys think, and feel free to subscribe, and just like do them because they're really important to incorporate into your training. You don't want to just do your main work and that's it. So it's kind of been a long rambling video, but yeah, that's just kind of my general thoughts on that topic.